Hello, everyone. How are we doing today?
Very good, thank you. How
How
are
are
you?
you?
Oh, I'm good. Thank you, guys. I figured let's give a couple moments for people to come in. Um, we'll probably start around like 2:05 maybe.
Here in Atarva, nice to see you. They're with SB Energy as well, Olivia.
Hello.
Hoping we see some familiar faces from last week as well. But I do know that it's set up where if you can't come every week, that's okay. But we're hoping for consistent turnout every week.
Some of these are SB Energy interns. They've unfortunately heard me speak on very similar topics, so they'll have to unfortunately be subject to this again.
Never a bad idea to keep reiterating some information. You never know when you might need it.
This extends to other companies as well. I imagine I was just looking at the website. Okay.
And we are recording this, so it'll go up on our socials, and then there'll also be people who view it from there if they're unavailable to come to this meeting or for any other reason.
Sure. That's great. It's a really great initiative. I was reading about the history with the Win for Schools and all that. So that's wonderful to see.
Yeah, thank you. It's been it's been a journey, but we're enjoying the ride so far. All right, I guess we'll give people about 1 or 2 more minutes to come in before we start. Okay, I think I'm gonna go ahead and get started on our introductions. Thank you guys for coming to our Summer Intern Network meeting this week. We have a very exciting presentation from Supriya with SB Energy. But before we get into that, I just wanted to remind you guys to join our mailing list and to fill out the Summer Intern Network form if you have not. I'll put that in the chat in just 1 minute. And some other QR codes we have at the bottom is to apply for the REpS conference experience. If you missed last week's presentation with Remy and Repowering Schools, it helps students and people in industry to be able to go to these kinds of conferences such as REpS, and it'll help cover your registration in your hotels. So it's a really great opportunity. If you're interested, I highly encourage you applying for it. And then we have our career committee where we'll be doing stories and really small interviews with both students in the renewable energy field and industry members. So if you're interested in either helping develop that or share your story, please fill out that QR code as well. We'd be really grateful for that. And next week, we're going to have a networking event. So stay tuned for that, and I hope to see you guys there next week. Before we begin, does anyone have any questions or anything before I pass it on to Supriya? Okay. If something comes up, you can always message me in the chat directly, but let's go ahead. Oh no, why is my photo not showing up? I'm so sorry. I had a headshot on there, but I'm not sure why it's showing up.
Don't worry.
It is my pleasure to introduce Supriya Ranade, who is head of power markets at SB Energy. She has more than 15 years of experience in the North American power, gas, and environmental markets. Prior to joining SB Energy, she managed structured transactions at Lightsource BP, Direct Energy, BGC Partners, and Evolution Markets. Mrs. Ranade received her bachelor's in science and environmental science from Johns Hopkins University and her master's in science in environmental engineering at Columbia University. She currently serves on the Tax and Finance Advisory Committee for SIA and is a friend of the Institute for Science and Policy at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so you can share yours if that sounds good for you, Supriya.
Yeah, that's great.
You should have access, so let me know if you're not able to.
So it says host disabled participants.
Okay, let me see what I can do. There we go. You should be able to now.
Oh, super. All right. All right, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Olivia. Thank you to Brenda for the opportunity to work with this organization. This is the first kind of involvement I've had with Repowering Schools. And as I mentioned to Olivia, was reading about the program and the types of initiatives. And it's really great to see, a clean energy industries focused program for, interested students to, just get more access, broaden the network, and get a broader lens into this industry. So it's really great to be here. I've done, several iterations of this type of presentation, both over the course of a couple of years with our own internship program here at SB Energy. And I also work with several smaller conference outfits doing an intro sort of to renewables and general market trends and what we're seeing. I try to keep this sort of deck updated based on, what we're seeing real time on the offtake discussions in the power market side, as things are constantly evolving and constantly changing. And so I try to keep the information, up to date and up to speed. And with all of the forums that I've done before, I like to have sort of a, discussion too. So if there's questions in between my slides or content or, presentation, please feel free to ask. Any questions at all. It can be, content wise or anything related to, the slides here would be great at any point. As Libby mentioned, I spent my whole career in the energy industry. It's been just a wonderful journey for myself, and I've learned so much. And what I'm trying to distill in these slides is kind of where I sit in the industry right now. I work with an IPP called SB Energy. We're one of the fastest growing IPPs in the country with 2 gigawatts. I'll flip over to the slide. I'm already starting to talk through the introduction to our company. Let me actually do a full screen here. We have 2 gigawatts of operating assets, about a gigawatt under construction across the Texas ERCOT and California ISO. And there were 10 gigawatts of projects under development. We are a full owner, operator, and developer of renewable energy projects with a strong focus on utility scale solar and storage. Storage, I'll just add a little bit. We have a partnership with ESS Technologies, which is an iron flow battery module, which basically can provide energy storage capabilities and ancillary services for 8 to 12 hours. So it's a little bit different than the more broadly scaled lithium ion type modules out there. And so when we say solar and storage, we work with all sorts of different technologies within those two cohorts or those two supply chains. I lead power markets. What does that mean? That's, longer term power purchase agreements, working a lot with our development pipeline on sourcing offtake agreements, with counterparties such as utilities, power marketers, commercial industrial load, data center load. There's a whole sort of host of entities out there that are looking to procure renewable energy for the long term. And so my team largely focuses on that. I also help with our operating fleet. Once projects come online and are operating, we as IPPs across the industry have to maintain their performance and make sure that we're de-risking our project performance with relation to whatever happens in the wholesale power markets, which can be unpredictable at times. And so we have to have a good hedging strategy in place. And my team manages a lot of the short-term transactional work related to our revenue stack. That's renewables, the environmental attributes, that's the energy, and then that's, of course, the battery attributes with the capacity and energy arbitrage and stuff we'll get into a little bit later as we talk about the revenue stack of these projects. Just to quickly rewind to talk about the agenda, because I sort of skipped over that, gave the introduction. What we'll talk about is select market trends, and these are recent trends that, we are, real-time seeing here in the origination seat at SB Energy. Then I'll get into renewable energy projects and the revenue stack, what products we can monetize from these projects that make our internal rate of returns pencil. And then we'll get into PPA highlights, talking about several key provisions of PPAs that we typically focus on. We call them the salient commercial terms of a transaction. They're typically qualifiers for us if we want to proceed with an off-taker, and similarly, if an off-taker wants to proceed with us. These are sort of the key commercial terms that we look at. And then we'll talk about new applications for renewable energy as well. There's a lot of new innovation going on in the space, and we'll sort of touch upon that and the use cases there. So getting into select market trends, and I'll actually keep my time check here because I tend to ramble sometimes, go way past time. So talking about demand growth. So whenever we think about the market and electric power, always like to focus, first and foremost on the fundamentals, supply and demand. So let's talk about demand first. Over the course of the last 2 years, as opposed to the last 15 years, there's been an unprecedented amount of demand growth here in the US in select areas. And that's largely driven by data center development, manufacturing activity increases, and just general load growth due to climate change and some weather events that have happened that really have sort of pushed upward select regions and their demand forecasts, primarily in Texas and California, across the Midwest and pockets of the Mid-Atlantic. Over the past year, this is an important point, grid planners nearly double the 5-year load growth forecast. So previous to that, 15 years, we saw an era of flat or declining load growth. Now we're seeing grid operators actually escalating that load growth due to all these demand drivers. And it's very, very important because the next conversation is, well, is there enough supply to meet that demand? And how is the grid going to manage and balance all of the types of renewables and types of supply that's coming onto the grid? Because the supply stack of the grid is going to look very different in the next 5 to 10 years versus the supply stack today, and certainly versus the supply stack in the past. Decommissioning retirement of aging conventional generation fleet is also driving the need for clean energy infrastructure. This is a very big point. For example, in PJM, which is the Mid-Atlantic power pool, it's the largest power pool in the US, serving over 180 gigawatts peak. Is forecasted to retire nearly 58% of their baseload generation by 2030. And that's a significant amount of baseload that's going to be retired due to the inability to run economically, cost of supply chain for coal and natural gas, largely inefficient when compared to some of the newer technologies out there, the newer gas peaker plants, combined cycle technologies out there. So it's not economic to operate these older facilities anymore. And so they will have to be retired in some capacity. And so that, that's a big void to fill. And so grid planners are very much have the job of assessing if all the new and clean technologies that's, slated right now in the interconnection queues and being put through the study process and so forth, can that supply be adequate to match this massive, growing demand? And I just wanted to point out there's an excellent report done by a company called Grid Strategies at the end of last year that really talked about many of these demand growth drivers. And it's a great read. I've cited it here, and so I encourage all of you to check it out if you're interested. Coupled with demand growth, you see a massive growth in renewables and energy storage. And the EIA puts out the short-term energy outlook every quarter, and sometimes updates it throughout the year. And they have amazing statistics that show that wind and solar energy will really lead growth of the overall U.S. power generation structure through 2025. And in fact, solar power singled out from the renewable stack will grow about 75% between 2023 and 2025. And there's lots of reasons for that. And we'll get into why solar as opposed to wind, as opposed to nuclear and some of the other types of technologies out there is so much more accelerated than the rest of it. It's an important point to note that annual renewable power generation surpassed nuclear generation for the first time in 2021, and coal generation for the first time in 2022. And this, again, just speaks to the volume of energy from renewables that is coming online onto the grid. I will say that the EIA accounts for this on a total megawatt hour basis. They don't really count towards the total megawatt basis. And there's an important distinction between megawatts, which is the slated capacity, and the megawatt hours, which is the actual energy generation. Because as we all know, and I should have probably put this in this discussion, all of these resource and asset classes have a capacity factor, i.e. When they're available, what percentage of time they're available throughout the year. And as we know, solar operates and performs when the sun's shining, wind when the wind's blowing, biomass when there's available, feedstock, for example, landfill gas or, other kind of biofuel feedstock, geothermal heat in the ground. And all of these different asset classes have different capacity factors. Solar generally has a capacity factor between, say, 20 to 30%, depending on the type of technology, depending on the use case, depending, of course, on the resource and the location of where solar is. And so when you talk about the total megawatt hours coming from solar versus total megawatts, versus the total megawatts coming from coal and megawatt hours, you'll see that coal and some of these baseload generators have a much higher capacity factor, i.e. they're able to provide more power to the grid in all hours versus solar and wind, which is able to provide power to the grid in select hours, given, again, the resource. So it's an important distinction to make, and there's a lot of implications of the wholesale power markets and how pricing develops and price formation in the future. We won't get into that today, but it's very important to understand that these grid operators across the country have a very important job of balancing intermittent technology and the growth of intermittent technology onto the grid, given the demand growth. So it becomes a very important exercise to balance those electrons on a real-time basis. Let's talk a little bit about why renewables are growing. There's 4 kind of big reasons that, I've looked at and isolated, happy to, chat through others, but these are the big 4 that, we really see. The first is ESG and general power needs. As I mentioned in the beginning, data centers and data center growth is really, and manufacturing growth is driving a lot of that, overall forecast. And many of these companies are large tech companies like the Amazons, the Metas, Microsoft, Googles of the world. And they have very, very ambitious clean energy targets, i.e. they want to match their procurement, their load needs with clean energy resources, carbon-free resources. And so that's driving a lot of the renewable energy procurement and a lot of the renewable energy build out there. SB Energy, our company, we have many different power purchase agreements with C&I or commercial industrial load for this purpose. Volatility in electricity prices and periods of acute volatility, for example, periods of like Q1 2022, Q4 2019. These are periods we can point to that that really saw a lot of volatility in the wholesale power markets, prices in select parts of the U.S., largely driven by the volatility in the natural gas price, which usually sets the marginal unit in most of these RTOs and ISOs. And due to that volatility, companies who have large energy spends as a part of their broader budgets want to be able to hedge their energy exposure or their exposure to the energy price. And they often do that by buying, long-term 15, 20-year renewable power purchase agreements or any power purchase agreements. But, typically, as we pointed out in the last slide, the major growth is in the renewable sector in the wind and solar space. And so a lot of the new PPAs are being signed with those technologies, as well as with storage. We'll talk a little bit about the balancing capability of storage and the ability to provide certain grid services that other inverter-based resources like wind and solar cannot provide. So people want to hedge their exposure to volatile energy prices is a second reason. Renewable portfolio standards, or RPSs, they are typically state-driven requirements that require load-serving entities or anyone serving electric load to end users to procure a certain percentage of that load from renewable energy resources, be it wind, biogas, solar. A plethora of different technologies is typically allowed in these state statutes. They all vary. So every single state is very, very different. You sometimes see the New England states have a lot of similar features, as well as the Mid-Atlantic states, based on the ISO or RTO in which they're located. But generally speaking, develop their own local renewable energy resources, and that's why these state portfolio standards vary. And in fact, that's why we saw a lot of growth, for example, in the state of New Jersey, which, at the time, circa, 2008, 2009, 2010, was actually the second largest state to have installed solar. Now it's fallen to fourth or fifth because of the larger scale projects that are coming online in Texas and in California and across the West. But those RPSs were a very, very strong driver early on of clean energy deployment. The other big reason is decommissioning of older baseload. As I mentioned before, oftentimes these older facilities that have been in operation for 20, 30, 40 years are just not economic anymore to run. The cost of operations exceeds the revenue forecasted for these plants. Older nuclear facilities, for example, need extensive operating costs adjustments that often falls often falls to ratepayers, and it's getting more and more difficult to justify those costs versus the cost to build and replace nuclear or older coal, older gas with cleaner and newer resources that don't have that same kind of levelized cost of energy, including operating costs. And so we are seeing, for example, in PJM, like I mentioned, in the Midwest ISO, in Texas, in California, and the broader West, a lot of older scale baseload retirements. California, most notably, has slated 2030 to fully retire Diablo Canyon 1 and 2, which will be, about a 2.2 gigawatt gap in their supply stack from a baseload perspective. So that's going to be very important for the state to, evaluate what resources can fill in that gap. And that's happening across the country. Bloomberg New Energy Finance, BNEF, they put out a fantastic report twice a year. It's called the Corporate Energy PPA Market Outlook. Highly encouraged. The links are there to you to read it. But they really track, what's going on PPA world in the U.S. and more broadly internationally, which a lot of the EU is really leading the charge with a lot of PPA execution. But it's interesting to see, like, while we're seeing kind of this very bullish trend in the demand, bullish trend in supply when it comes to clean energy, there are certain macro trends that are impacting the rate in which these deals or these PPAs are getting signed. And that's largely due to supply chain and high interest rates. Right now, the cost of financing due to the interest rate rising and the interest rate increases have really kind of put a big amount of pressure on developers like ourselves, because the cost to finance, the cost to underwrite these deals from tax equity and typical debt is so much higher, and the cost of borrowing is so much higher. Similarly, supply chain bottlenecks, while there is an unprecedented growth of U.S. manufacturing and onshoring of different technologies, we still see the majority of procurement of, various parts of the solar and wind and storage supply chain coming from Asia. And, we'll discuss, the particular tariffs that are in place and that have been reevaluated by the federal government and imposed by, the U.S. Trade Department, for example, on specific components of the clean energy supply chain that will now be assessed with a tariff. And so these increase our costs, increase the industry costs to build these projects. And that's what's slowing down a little bit of the growth, because now the LCOE, or the levelized cost of energy of solar and wind, becomes less competitive with the grid and buying electricity from the grid or from other resources, for example. A large part of this is, again, I mentioned the tech companies with these very ambitious clean energy goals. For example, Microsoft has a 100% clean energy goal by 2030. Google has a 100% 24/7 clean energy goal by 2035, which again, they're trying to match all 24/7 hours in the day and the year with clean energy and storage. And so this is what's driving a lot of the PPA activities that we see here, despite, these headwinds that we've identified. Transmission. You can't open, New York Times or Wall Street Journal or really any periodical today without reading about how much transmission the U.S. needs because of this unprecedented demand growth and the unprecedented amount of renewables and clean energy hitting the grid to meet that demand growth. All right. So the cost of transmission is a very hotly, or has been a very hotly contested topic. You can see here, this chart, this table on the left is really illuminating to me. You look at certain regions in the US and you see that there is like over 3,000% growth need for high voltage transmission. And so when you look at these numbers, they're pretty staggering. There is so much more high voltage transmission in the US in select regions that have to get built. How are we going to pay for it? How's the grid going to pay for it? How's the utility going to pay for it? How are the ratepayers going to pay for it? And so that cost allocation mechanism was largely there was a big effort by FERC, and I'll get into that in a subsequent slide, to really allocate who is going to pay for high voltage transmission, when and how. So that ruling just came out last month, and it's expected that it's going to be taken up by Congress to really get into the details of that allocation mechanism. But essentially what it does, it also requires utilities and balancing authorities and RTOs and ISOs to plan for new transmission and high voltage transmission on a 20-year horizon, whereas previously the requirements were around 3 to 5 years and they weren't, mandated. And so now now FERC is really saying, all right, guys, you need to really start planning ahead, because there's such a demand growth explosion, there's such a supply need to fill in that shortfall, and so there has to be a 20-year planning horizon. I wonder if I'm to say anything else here. I think, yeah, we'll go on to the next slide. So here's where we talk about the 4 big sort of pieces that impact transmission and supply chain, as I mentioned. May was a very, very active month for the White House and for FERC and for, several federal agencies around the renewable energy supply chain as well as transmission. May 15th, we saw the initiation of a new AD/CVD case for crystalline silicon PV imports. There's a whole sort of discussion here on where these modules are being manufactured, where the crystalline is coming from, and there's extensive labor laws that are being highly scrutinized in many of these regions that implement a tariff. There's a need to implement tariffs sometimes on these particular areas and geographies. Bifacial modules, for example, there was a 2-year sort of hiatus on the bifacial tariff. Now that's been re-implemented. That is the Section 201 tariffs. That is going to largely impact a lot of the U.S. supply and a lot of the U.S. projects getting built, because bifacial are some of the highest efficiency solar panels out there. They're about 5 to 15%, depending on the geography, more efficient than, say, single tracker or thin film modules, for example. The China 301 tariff, this is important because this is going to impact battery supply chain, specifically, lithium ion, both for EVs and for utility scale applications, increase from 7.5% to 25%. And that decision and that cost structure and that tariff structure will be delayed until 2026. Semiconductors, the tariff will increase from 25% to 50%. So if you can imagine, these various pieces, make up your CapEx portion of your levelized cost of energy for an overall project. When certain components are now being inflated by, 25 or 50%, that's significantly going to drive up your cost that you need to recover, or your LCOE, or PPA rate, what we call it interchangeably. So these are really important to maintain and to make sure that, as an IPP, as an industry, we're ahead of this. We can de-risk against some of these tariffs, that we have foresight into the implementation of these tariffs. But this is a big important thing for all of us in the clean energy space. So let's get into the revenue overview. How do solar, wind, batteries make money in the wholesale power markets aside from the PPA rate? And we'll focus first on solar. So solar, of course, solar can realize an energy rate or $1 per megawatt hour. Sells into the grid, gets paid by the grid, some energy rate. Solar in some RTOs and ISOs can also qualify as a capacity resource or a must-offer resource, in which they're also given a capacity payment, either by the grid or by the utility in which they're operating. And that is really just saying that the solar is available, it's steel in the ground, it's a fixed $1 per megawatt day or KW month payment. And it's not performance-based. It can be performance-based in the event of a grid shortage or a grid event where the resource is called on to generate energy, but generally speaking, it's a flat payment that's paid monthly or annually. Reactive power in PJM, in the Midwest ISO, and some parts of the Pacific Northwest. Reactive power is the ability to provide voltage support to the grid. So some inverter-based resources, especially the newer ones that are coming out with newer inverter technologies, can provide voltage control or voltage support. And FERC has a reactive power tariff in which that generator can apply once it's operational and realize a similar kind of capacity payment, showing that the generator is available for voltage support throughout the year. And of course, we have the environmental attributes, the RECs. Those are typically assessed on every single megawatt hour that's generated from a clean energy project. And RECs, throughout the different states and throughout the different markets have different prices. We can get into that a little bit later, based on the RPS, based on the alternative compliance payments. So states that have a mandated program are called compliance states. And then there's a national voluntary market in which any renewable generator can sell into. And typically the demand there is from corporates and industrials and utilities with a green pricing program. Moving on to storage, that's the other sort of big growth technology here in the US. Storage also realizes an energy rate, but as we know, storage charges and discharges, so that spread is typically called energy arbitrage. Typically occurs in the day-ahead market, so it's typically thought of as an intrinsic energy resource. The battery is always going to charge and discharge to the extent available, to the extent it makes sense based on price movement and price forecasts. Batteries can also realize capacity, and especially in the California ISO, where the resource adequacy, that's their capacity program, is a very valuable source of revenue for batteries today. As well as in PJM, as well as in the Midwest ISO, batteries can provide capacity attributes. Ancillary services, the ability for batteries to charge, discharge, or provide fast responding needs to the grid allows them to participate in several of the ancillary services markets. For example, in ERCOT, where you have a 15-minute ramping need in certain ancillary service markets, in CAISO, where we have a 5 or 2 hour need, depending on which market you're bidding into. Batteries are perfectly suited to provide these services, and as such can bid into or clear the AS markets in many areas. And they're also subject to reactive power compensation per the FERC tariff as well. Again, they're inverter-based resources. They have the ability to provide voltage control by their charge and discharging characteristics, and can be awarded this tariff as well. So a little bit of an overview of the capacity markets, and I'm going to sort of breeze a little bit through these slides because it's probably content that you guys have already seen before. But again, just talking through the different types of ways renewable projects can realize revenue. Capacity payments, like I mentioned, are thought of as steel in the ground payments. You're available, you can provide capacity to the grid if needed, and therefore you'll get this payment on a monthly or annual basis. For solar, that payment is largely derated, or it's decreased versus like a baseload resource, because again, we talked about the intermittency of solar. And that ability to provide peaking services or energy in peak periods, or where the grid is forecasted to be very short, or stated differently, the reserve margin is supposed to be very low. The grid creates these forecasts. It's called the estimating load carrying capability, or the ELCC, which basically assesses how well a resource can provide peak needs for a grid. Like I mentioned before, solar ELCCs are much lower than baseload generators due to their intermittency, whereas you see ELCCs are much higher for baseload and energy storage that can provide peaking capacity when the grid needs it. So they get more money for that, for doing that. Renewable energy credits, just wanted to again highlight that these are typically state-driven mandates, requiring LLCs or load-serving entities to procure a certain percentage of energy from renewable resources. Big demand growth driver in the early years of renewable energy adoption in the U.S. It's an increasingly, these targets can increase year over year, where you have, a lot of cities in these states, like, for example, the city of Denver or the city of Austin, creating mandates for their own jurisdiction to actually go above and beyond the state renewable portfolio standard. And so they have their own REC program, for example, in the city of Austin, and the city of Denver, where they're buying REC separate from the state compliance market. And so these are just different demand drivers that we watch as our projects can produce renewable energy credits. We talked a little bit about ancillary services. I won't spend too much time here, but it is interesting that like all markets, it's all based on supply and demand. And so batteries, while they're able to provide ancillary services, the more and more batteries that are coming online, will slowly saturate those particular ancillary service markets that the grid creates. And so that's a good thing, right? Because now there's enough supply increasingly to meet these sort of very short-term fast responding needs that the grid may have due to, again, the amount of intermittency that's hitting the grid. But it's interesting from a revenue forecasting perspective too. The exercise that we have here at SB Energy is, okay, well, there is an ancillary service or set of ancillary service payments available today. What will that look like in 5, 10, 15 years? Will the battery have to participate more and more in the energy markets? And that's where we realize our revenue versus the AS markets. And that's sort of the thinking that a lot of IPPs are doing, because a lot of them are contemplating integrating battery storage into their generation portfolios. So now we'll get into PPAs. This is the bulk of the work that I do here at SB Energy that I've done over the past couple of years, at the various places that I've been at. And what I will say is that, when we think about PPAs, the first thing people think of is price. And I always say, and everyone says who does this work, price isn't everything. Off-takers and generators and sellers have to look at the whole project to make sure that everything around the project, the COD, the tenor, the delivery of the product, where the project is located basis, the security and the rating of the entity selling and buying, right? Because both the off-taker credit profile as well as the seller credit profile is very, very important, because these, again, are 15, 20, 25-year deals. They can be shorter, they can be longer, but generally speaking, a lot of the PPAs that are getting signed are in that sort of time frame. And so you're basically, executing a deal with a partner who you hope will be in business by year 14 and 15, or by the end of your PPA. You want to make sure that they're still delivering power. Subsequently, you still want to make sure that you're still getting paid for that power. So credit is very important. Availability guarantees are especially important for renewable projects, as we mentioned, and we'll get into that. The difference between availability and performance guarantees. There are a lot of requirements on renewable generators to make sure that they're performing at the top of their sort of assessment level. Typically, these projects get assessed by independent engineers, and they're expected to really drive performance of their asset. Otherwise, they get hit by what are called LDs, or liquidated damages, if they dip below that performance threshold. Volume. Volume is quite simply the amount of capacity or the amount of megawatt hours energy that an off-taker is buying. And quite frequently, we see a lot of these different components that make up the price change once you talk about smaller volumes or larger volumes. The market, can trade various different types of products. And so volume is a very big consideration, especially when you think about a utility or a load serving entity that has procurement obligations in order to meet compliance or state RPS goals, customer goals, and so forth. The volume component becomes very important. We talked a little bit about credit, so I'm going to skip over this. Let's talk a little bit about PPA contracts and structures. There's various flavors of PPAs. I would say, in sort of my work over the past, 5 to 10 years, we saw a lot of creativity on the offtake side, probably around between 2017 and 2020, where you had constructs like proxy generation PPAs or proxy generation swaps. A lot of hub settled fixed shape deals. We'll get into what that terminology means. But now more and more you see sort of the contract du jour for renewables really as an as generated product. that's either busbar or nodal settled, i.e. the project is settling the energy with the off-taker where the project's actually delivering the energy at the project node, or at some physical hub that is, at a location that's different than the project. And hopefully that project pricing node has similar characteristics as the hub in which it's settling in. And so that typically is called a contract for differences, and it allows off-takers like the C&I sector or utilities or whoever the off-taker is to purchase energy that's not within their actual service territory, but within the grid. It's a financial product. They're not actually buying the physical electrons from that project. They're just paying for an energy hedge from that product. So there's a little bit of a difference and nuance there. There's several types of CFDs or contract for differences. You have virtual power purchase agreements. This is probably the majority of PPAs that are getting signed. I've walked through sort of the project profit and loss, how the project actually settles or the project's realized revenue. You have a sale at the project node multiplied by the volume, Q is volume. And then you have your energy settlement, which is done at the hub. So it's both a purchase of the same quantity of energy that you're selling at the node and a sale at the hub for that fixed price. You're basically selling hub energy for your PPA price. And that's the sort of the overall mechanic of the VPPA. You have proxy generation PPAs, which are typically always hub settled. And the big difference between VPPAs and PGPPAs is that the volume is not based on the actual meter generation. It's based on where some satellite can show that the project should be generating. So there's a really neat kind of constructs in that your project could be generating more or less, but if the satellite data or the satellite index is reading that your project should be generating X, that is a volume that the off-taker and the developer are settling against at some fixed price. Then you have hedges, which are typically fixed volume or financial swaps. And those are typically an hourly fixed quantity for every month out of the year. So that could be the same quantity for every single month of the year, or for solar, for example, is built up in a 12 by 24. So for every hour in every particular month, you're expected to generate and deliver X amount of megawatts. And that's fixed over the 10, 15, 20-year lifetime of the project. So they're risky, right? Because projects, as we know, solar and wind don't always generate when their sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing. So there's ways to de-risk these fixed shape deals, and they follow a very different risk profile. Batteries can take the form of tolling agreements or capacity plus energy swaps or just energy swaps. Tolling agreements can be hub settled or bus settled. Essentially means that the full value of the battery, the ancillary services, the energy arbitrage, the capacity is all rolled up into one flat overall capacity payment that the buyer pays to the seller. These are very de-risked deals, i.e. the seller is not wearing the energy market risk. That's really largely on the off-taker or the buyer of the project. But the seller is typically owning and operating that battery as per the requirements of the tolling agreement for the buyer. So the seller gets a fixed price, buyer gets, whatever the market optimization work they do, and they realize that revenue. Energy swaps are, just going with the intrinsic value of the battery. So that top four, bottom four, or TNBN, what we call it, based on the duration of the battery, is really the arbitrage opportunity for that particular unit. And typically these swaps are priced based on some expectation of the spread of the top and bottom end hours of the day over the period of the contract. So the off-taker will have a view of what those top 2 hours in the grid versus the bottom 2 hours are for the entire duration, as will the seller, and typically come to some negotiation on, where they see the energy markets heading. That TNBN typically has an RA component in California, for example, where you're selling the capacity attribute at a fixed price, and then you have the energy swap on top of that. Typically, in these instances, the seller or the owner of the project is realizing any ancillary services upside. The off-taker typically doesn't want that. And then sometimes for batteries, you have an RA only or capacity only payment, which is like a full toll, except only taking the capacity attributes, not the energy arb and not the ancillary services benefits or the extrinsic benefits. Here, this slide really shows that the COD, in a lot of the work that we do, especially with utilities and load serving entities, given that they have long-term planning needs, right? We talked a little bit about the FERC order that creates these long-term planning needs for the grid operators. Well, utilities municipalities, a lot of, public entities have, planning needs as well. And that's typically formulated in their integrated resources plan. And that plan essentially says that year over year, here is where we expect demand to be as a balancing authority or as a utility service provider. And here's the expected supply that we'll need to meet that demand. And that's a very oversimplified kind of goal of an IRP, but essentially that's what the utility is doing. And part of that, because of these sort of annual targets or biannual targets, the COD of projects and the type of projects that they're looking for matters significantly. So the COD, from the COD typically flows a lot of the PPA prices. So for nearer term projects, because there's such a big need, as we talked about, can command a higher PPA price, for example, versus a project, say, coming online in 2030 or 2032, where there's a lot more uncertainty in the supply-demand picture, and it will command, as a result, a much lower PPA price. And typically, you see that in the COD trajectory of projects, that sort of PPA price backwardation. CODs are very important because there's a lot of covenants and a lot of requirements within the document that make sure that the project is on track to meeting that COD. And in fact, a lot of PPAs that we've worked on, you can accrue delay damages or liquidated damages if you don't meet certain milestones related to the interconnection agreement being signed, related to construction start, related to certain permits being secured, because, similar to the transmission story, is the permitting story, right? We've all heard of permitting delays and, counties and local jurisdictions being overwhelmed by the amount of permit applications and the, short staff of the ability to actually go out and evaluate the impact to fish and wildlife, for example, or other endangered species. So this is also a big sort of headwind and a big challenge for renewables. As we know, solar and wind, they take up a lot more space to develop and to operate than, say, a nuclear or a baseload plant. And so there's a lot more permitting that has to occur because of this reason, and a lot of those are environmental permits. PPA securities are collateral. Both the off-taker is expected to have some form of collateral, either in a parent guarantee, or maybe they have a credit rating that's, investment grade, that's, form of collateral, as well as a developer. And so that's a big negotiation point, how much security is needed to collateralize a 15, 20, 25-year deal based on a certain asset class. And assignment and control, I add this in, because more and more you see there's a lot more M&A or mergers and acquisition activity in the renewable space, both on a company level and a project level. And, these projects are constantly changing hands, depending on which developers can actually build and construct and own and operate these plants, given, again, the supply chain challenges and sort of the headwinds that we see in the industry. Certain developers don't want to take the position of actually owning and operating the plant. They just want to develop and then change hands or sell their project. And so this kind of provision in PPA is very important because the entity signing the PPA today may not be the same entity who's operating the plant 5-10 years from now. I'm going to shift over this a little bit because I realize we have only about 10 minutes. And what I will spend about a couple of minutes talking about is sort of new applications of PPAs and a lot of the work that we're doing here at SB Energy and we're thinking about as an industry. And as I mentioned before, many of the large tech companies and C&I loads and people who are building the manufacturing and the data centers in the US really want to be cognizant and deliberate about the energy that they're using. And so you see a lot of these industry groups form, one is the 24/7 CFE or Carbon Free Energy Compact that has been signed by over 135 different companies such as Google and Microsoft and others out there that are basically addressing the fact that they have these huge demand targets, a huge amount of growth. And so they want to really support the clean energy industry and they want that, demand to be met by clean energy supply versus, coal or older natural gas plants or grid system mix plants. These CFE targets are, very ambitious and they're very complex because essentially what these CFE targets are doing is that they're requiring the seller of this product, typically some combination of solar, wind, and hydropower, to meet, 90 to 100%, or sometimes it's 80 to 100% of their 24/7, of the buyer's 24/7 load requirements. And those load requirements can change, right? You build a data center, you might expand that data center, or it might shrink, or whatever that load requirement is. The energy source that's providing the electricity has to be able to adjust as well. And that can happen hourly, right? The demands of a data center, while we always talk about 24/7 demand, that's actually in reality, when you look at typical demand data center profiles, it's not 24/7. It can range throughout the day, and that energy source has to accommodate based on that. So these are very complex deals. It's not an as generated deal. In fact, it's an hourly commitment that we're typically signing up for. Another sort of industry cohort has really gone with this emissions first concept, i.e. they want to build and procure energy from areas that don't historically have a lot of renewable located already. So for example, in West Virginia, there's areas of West Virginia that have, still are very coal heavy, or Ohio, or, parts of the Midwest, or even the Pacific Northwest, where there's still, a handful of coal plants. These entities like Amazon, AWS, for example, they're leading the charge here with other companies. And we're part of both industry groups. They're saying that we want to develop projects and we really want to focus on the locational marginal emissions, i.e. what is the impact to that local grid of generating a clean energy electron? If that, again, is in a very coal heavy area, that impact to the grid of that clean energy electron is much higher than, say, California or parts of California where there's already a lot of solar and wind being generated. So there's a little bit of a difference in the methodology and the approach. Both ultimately get to the same place, right? They both want to buy clean energy. It's a matter of how and where. Here's an example. We've done a lot of analytics in-house here at SP Energy, and this is such a big focus of the company. It's super interesting work that's done by our innovations team, in which they're actually planning a resource offering, a resource mix offering based on a certain load profile. And as you can see, you have solar, wind, and batteries, various flavors of battery durations. And given a certain load profile, you have an excess and a shortage of each of those resources at every single hour. And sometimes when you look at a 15-minute interval versus a 60-minute interval, that shortage, that balancing becomes very, very complex. And so we do a lot of work with looking at the hourly looking at the hourly level for a lot of these load requirements for these CNIs who are looking for these very ambitious targets. Decommissioning, it's been really, really interesting over the last, 2 to 3 years to see how many, coal, nuclear, older gas plants are retiring and what those utilities are doing to fill the need. Some are building newer gas plants, but, more often than not, you see solar, storage, wind being used to replace the gap that was, previously filled by older baseload. And it's really interesting because they're going through that same kind of analytics exercise as we're doing here to make sure that, the intermittency coupled with the short duration storage can meet the needs of, what was previously a baseload generator, the ability to generate from coal, for example, 24/7 or for all the time. So these are just really interesting applications that, the renewable energy industry is really looking at and tackling in order to make the case or to really build the value of our projects for these utilities that maybe previously have not been, huge buyers of these projects in the past. So I'll pause there. I know I kind of went on a little bit. I did want to leave like 10 minutes for questions, but, wanted to certainly, address anything that's come up, or if there's any, anything you guys want to talk about.
I had a question. I don't know if I'm thinking about this correctly, but in one of the slides you mentioned that financing money for the projects is getting difficult, or like financial institutions are giving high interest rates to finance those projects. But on the other hand, we have so many companies that want to be powered by clean energy by 2030, 2035. So I don't understand that when there is such a increase in demand for clean energy, why is it on the contrary difficult to finance these projects? Because if there is a demand for it, shouldn't financial institutions be encouraging it by giving competitive interest rates or something? So
That's a really, really good question. And just at a high level, the interest rate is set by, the federal government. And so there's very little control that the general industry has over that interest rate. You can hedge the interest rate, lock in an interest rate at the time of financing for the term of the PPA, which is typically done, or for however many years within that PPA. So you're not you don't have to increase the amount of dollars that you're using to finance a project or to borrow money, for example. But I think the big question here is that given, interest rates, supply chain, these are all sort of smaller components that drive up the cost of energy. And so when you talk about renewables right now, the big conversation has been, renewables to date have been very competitive, cost competitive with other generating technologies. But when you drive up that cost, that LCOE, the levelized cost of energy, no longer is as competitive. Taken into the fact that there is so much demand growth, a lot of companies are saying, okay, well, we have these clean energy targets. Do we buy today? Or do we buy maybe in 3 to 5 years when we are seeing that demand growth actually materialize? And that's a question that we're kind of being posed quite frequently by different off-takers, is that, okay, the cost, the LCOEs of these projects right now are at an all-time high. You look at PPA prices, and maybe I should include that slide here. PPA prices over the last 5 to 10 years have only risen because of these, these macro trends related to inflation, interest rates, supply chain, and so forth. And so the deferral sort of question becomes big on people's minds, off-takers' minds, is that do we just buy from the grid today and then think about 15-year PPAs in the future? So it's a really good question. And, we did see, like I said, in the Bloomberg, first quarter report, that the rate at which PPAs are being signed over the last 2 quarters has actually been slowing down because of that. That doesn't, dismiss the need to actually get these projects built. It's just going to be a question of cost. So it's a really good question. Anything else? Well, if anyone else has any questions, there's always a lot to talk about with these, very front and center topics. You have my email. I think Remy, Olivia, you guys have my email, so please feel free to distribute that. And I'm happy to be a resource for the SP Energy interns and anyone else on this call if you want to discuss more.
Thank you so much, Supriya. We really appreciate your very strong, very comprehensive presentation. It was a fantastic watch. And again, thank you so much for coming to present to us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Supriya. Bye,
Yeah.
all.
Bye. I know it is a couple minutes late, or a couple minutes before we're supposed to end. So if anyone is busy, I understand. But if you guys wanted to stay on for maybe a couple more minutes, I would love to hear some updates on how your internships are going. Any updates you'd love to share, I'd love to hear about it.
Not many updates, but yeah, just from our last session, I just had a question about the REpS summit, or what should I call it?
Yeah,
the
the
conference.
conference.
Yeah. I believe you shared a link to register for that in the slides, right?
Yes. Would you like me to pull it up for you again?
I think I have the slides, but I just wanted to ask. So apart from the link that you shared, I saw other registration link on the site regarding volunteers or other types of registration. So is this different from any of those? Is this for any? You mentioned this also covers the cost of travel and stay as well. So, or is that a paid option?
Yeah, so I do have to clarify that the conference experience covers the cost of the registration fee and the hotels, but it doesn't cover travel. That is the one thing that you would be responsible for. And I would have to double check with Remy and get back to you because I'm not sure exactly if we do the registration for you or if we'll reimburse you for your registration.
Right.
But I can double check and get that to you as soon as possible, if that was your question.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Yeah, even if you could just find out something by the next session next week,
Yeah.
that should be fine as well.
And if you were interested, you could go ahead and fill out that form if you wanted to. And then we can just have you there and
Okay.
get you on our mailing list or anything.
All right. Yeah, I'll fill out that form. And yeah, so all right. Thank you.
Thank you, Zahir.
Mhm.
Okay, well, I appreciate you guys for staying. Thank you
Thank you
so
so
much.
much.
Have a good one.
You too. Bye bye.
Bye.